So I'm going to start by showing you guys a graph. Now, last fall, two political scientists from Northwestern and Princeton released what is already being hailed as a landmark study looking at the independent influence of different actors on our policymaking. They looked at over 2,000 policy areas over a 20-year period, and when they were looking at the impact of economic elites, they found that as support for a particular policy went up, the likelihood of that policy getting passed went up as well, as it should be. They found a very similar finding for organized business interest. Now, but when they looked at the independent influence of average citizens, this is what they found. Literally a flat line. So what that means is that whether the vast majority of the public believed in a policy or hardly anyone at all, it didn't matter. So they concluded that average citizens have little or no influence on our public policy making. Now, we're supposed to be a republic of the people, by the people, and for the people. Today's reality falls far short of that aspiration. And we at the Playbook Project believe that this is both a moral crisis and a practical crisis. It's a moral crisis because this is not who we say we are. It's a practical crisis because engaging the many was intended as a critical part of how we would safeguard our republic and its citizens. James Madison in the Federalist Papers talked about extend the sphere to take in a greater variety of parties and interests to protect against what he called the violence of faction. Now, we as a society are facing complex threats on a range of different fronts. Rising economic inequality, burgeoning federal debt, threats to our national security, threats to our environment. On each of these issues, we are all paying a price for a democracy that is working more effectively on behalf of the few than the many. So, if we allow the big banks to write the rules of our financial regulations, we all pay the price with our hard-earned savings. If defense contractors get billions of dollars for unnecessary weapons and we have slashed budgets, then our troops pay the price with inadequate care. Or if we let industry alone determine what constitutes pollution, then our children pay the price with their future. On each of these issues and countless more, the force of our federal government is in jeopardy of being dominated by the preferences of a select few. So if we allow those with vested interest to take the place of the people as the ultimate source of authority in our republic, then we put both our identity and our future as a nation at risk. Now, we believe that we as a nation have faced critical challenges before, and we've come together to address those challenges. We believe that this is the defining challenge of our generation. Now, just to be clear, we do not believe that public policy should be made exclusively based on public opinion polls. But we should acknowledge that the status quo in which everyday people, their power has literally flatlined, is not acceptable or sustainable. So, as we look at the underlying causes of this, of course, the core feature of elected representation was intended to be the way that people's authority was to be reflected, that the accountability of our elected officials was to be ensured. So we have here a distortion of representation. And in looking at that, we've tried to take a particularly empathetic lens to really put ourselves in the shoes of the candidate and think about it through his or her perspective. And we started with two basic assumptions. The first assumption is that candidates are highly motivated to do whatever it takes to win office and stay in office. Getting more votes than the other guy is and should be a very strong objective. Secondly, if you need some people more than others, then it's a very rare soul that's not going to heed their needs more than the others. So those you need are those you heed. Of course, the whole notion of one person, one vote was meant to ensure that that sense of dependence was broadly distributed. But the critical calculus for any thoughtful candidate today is, what do I need to get those votes? And in today's world, there's a very standard set of best practices for navigating a modern campaign. There's a playbook, if you will. And the unfortunate fact of the matter is that today's playbook involves relying much more heavily on your donors or the partisans than everyday people. And that exerts an enormous influence on our elected officials to heed their needs more than others. Now, we're not the first people to identify this problem. As Elliot said, there are a lot of folks working on this, and the vast majority of the attention is going to look at legislative solutions or changing the rules in some way, perhaps through Supreme Court ruling. Now, what we believe at the Playbook Project is that there are other ways of approaching this problem that could complement those efforts, innovative ways of altering that playbook. so they would be more reliant on a broader cross-section of the electorate. And it's important to note that those playbooks have changed throughout history, and with them, their sense of accountability to their constituents. So I'm going to explain with an admittedly overly simplistic example. Think about when you were running for office in the middle of the 20th century. At that point, the name of the game was boots on the ground. Sure, you needed some money to run a viable campaign, but you also needed your volunteers. You needed people to go out in the street and knock on doors. And then there was the tectonic shift of television, which radically altered the playing field and also altered the strategies and tactics that it took to win. So at that point, the relative value of your volunteers really diminished, because frankly, they just weren't as important as the money to buy the ads to put them on the airwaves. So, and of course, if that's the case, then what we're going to see is our resulting elected officials are going to give more attention to that side of the equation. And just to be clear, this was not because of a change in the rules. This was a change in the conditions that led to a new, more innovative set of ways of winning that emerged that capitalized on those trends. Well, we're now living through a range of other tectonic shifts, right? We're seeing every industry around us get disrupted by technology. But it's not just technology alone. We're seeing demographic changes. We're moving towards becoming a majority-minority country in the not-too-distant future. We're seeing the millennial generation of coming of age, the first generation of digital natives. Socioeconomic factors. Too many people are seeing their standard of living stagnate or decline. We have historic levels of frustration with government and growing distrust of institutions generally. These are major shifts in our society. So there are going to be changes in this dynamic. And what we believe at the Pluribus Project is if there's any trait that's American, it's our capacity to innovate under those changing conditions. And we want to help cultivate new ways of winning that actually bring that power back to the many. So let's fast forward today and talk about what do we see in the modern campaign environment. Well, Obama got a lot of attention for leveraging new ways of winning that engage people in new and innovative ways. But the fact of the matter is that there was increased expenses as a result of that and increased needs for fundraising too. In addition, in this hyper-partisan period, we're seeing the power of the partisans increase as well. What we believe is that we're only beginning to see the full effect of those tectonic shifts take place, whether they're technological changes, demographic changes, socioeconomic changes. And we believe that it's possible, with a little bit of foresight and some American entrepreneurial spirit, that we can help develop a viable, people-powered playbook that would give folks a chance at winning while relying more heavily on their constituents in relation to their donors. Okay, now, I will admit that this is the part in my spiel where generally I have on a couple occasions had some references to flying pigs. I get it. This is a very entrenched and serious business, but consider this, that the single largest expense in campaigns today is still television advertising. Consider that in 10 years, the dominant voting bloc is going to be millennials. Millennials are not watching the television ads. What they are paying attention to is the video content that's shared with them from their friends. So the question that we want to explore, and that we hope our panelists and you will explore tonight, is how can we help alter the way the game is played by helping people win by relying more on human resources than financial resources? So, for example, can we help develop tools and tactics that enable people to get their message out, candidates to get their message out, while relying more on the people to do the sharing as opposed to the money to buy the ads? Or how can we harness the historic levels of public frustration to channel that into constructive pressure against the current way of running and support for a new way of running? In recent years, we've seen a lot of innovation and new ways of distributed organizing for social change. We've also seen in a few instances a pledge-based model where candidates will voluntarily decide to limit their use of money in their political campaigns. What if we could use those distributed organizing tools with the pledge-based model that would actually incur real costs on candidates if they ran with the old-fashioned way and real benefits to those who actually opted for a people-powered campaign? Now, these are just a couple examples. And obviously, there aren't going to be any silver bullets in this arena. But if we think about the scope of ambition for these innovations is no more ambitious than what we see all around us every day. And cumulatively, we think it could help make another way of winning possible. And it's worth thinking for just a minute about what that would mean. So first, let's think about who this would work for. Let's say you're a congressional candidate who has strong human relationships in your district, not a lot of financial backing. Well, this could give you a fighting chance. So we could start to see new types of candidates get into the game. And the beauty about our political system is that if just one person or two people win, then that methodology can start to spread. So we could start to see a new generation of candidates running, relying on their constituents as opposed to their donors or the partisans, which could lead to a much more responsive Congress. Now, we believe that this is an ambitious but a very possible aspiration. And so what we're hopeful is that if we can bring together the best traits of us as Americans, our capacity to innovate with this challenge, we can ultimately move us towards a politics that's much more responsive, one in which the people actually have power. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to hand it to David and our panelists to talk a little bit about this with all of y'all tonight. Thanks very much.
So I'm plugged in. Now I'm going to stall while the rest of them get plugged in. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Elliot, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Lucas. That was a wonderful summary of a lot of issues in a short amount of time. And it's a nice night for this topic. I'm feeling patriotic after watching the United States beat Germany 2-0. And if you did not watch it, I encourage you to watch the final on Sunday, right? Sunday. So we have a wonderful panel here, and I'm going to introduce folks starting from Heather. Don't get confused, we have two Heathers. Starting with Heather Smith on the far end and then coming. And then we're going to dive immediately into conversation. We're going to start, we have a great panel of folks who are going to agree on some things, and I predict not agree on everything. And we're actually going to dive right into the stuff where I think folks might not agree, and then I think we're going to work our way to the agreement. And my hope is that we end up then with some time to hear from you all. So Heather Smith ran Rock the Vote for 7 years, 2 presidential election cycles, both 2008 and 2012. Not boring presidential cycles. They registered 6 million people during that time, younger voters, and they took the process online. Heather's now working with Google, and she is working with Pluribus. So she is the voice on this panel of this new project. Next to Heather is John Pudner, who's the executive director of Take Back Our Republic, most recently and famously masterminded Dave Bratt's earth-shaking victory over Eric Cantor. I like the description of John on the Take Back Our Republic website. It says he's the go-to guy to help upstart candidates that didn't have the financial backing, which makes him perfect for this panel. I will confess, to me, by far the most impressive thing about John is he is one of 9 kids, and he liked the experience so much, he has 9 kids. Next to John is Heather McGee, who's now the president of Demos. And Heather rose up through Demos. She was before one of the senior people at Demos who really helped focus it on inequality. And before that was one of the top policy people on the John Edwards campaign for president, which, as Jim Tankersley just wrote in the Washington Post, the John Edwards campaign for president, while it had some weaknesses that we don't need to cover here, really helped set the agenda on a policy basis for the rest of the Democratic Party on a whole bunch of issues. There are a lot of ways in which Obama and Hillary followed Edwards' lead. And right next to me is Ben Rattray, the founder and CEO of Change.org, which is a social network for nonprofits and campaigns. There's a great list of Change.org victories on their website, petitions they've started have helped change. They got the NFL to renounce their nonprofit status. They helped pass the ABLE Act that helps people with disabilities. This is my favorite, though. They got the words "kids eat right" removed from Kraft processed cheese. So,
not a campaign we started.
so let's dive right in. Lucas touched on a little bit of this. The way I would almost summarize Lucas's talk is this. The notion that money buys elections is overrated, but the notion that money buys policy, if anything, is underrated. Right? It's not just that the richest people or the people that raise the most money get elected, right? Donald Trump, Carly Fiorina, I'm going to go out on a limb and say neither one of them will be elected president. You can say the same thing on the Democratic side. But it's clear that opinions of money and the elites do drive policy. And so what I want to start by asking you all is, if that were less the case, what do you think are the big policy areas that would be different? If that line that Lucas showed wasn't so straight, if it were tilted up, what policies do you think would be different?
I'm happy to take a stab.
Great.
So DEMOS is a public policy organization that was founded actually by Stephen Heinz, who's here in this room right now, and many others, around an idea that there is a connection between inequality in our democracy and inequality in our economy. And as I was listening to Lucas say that this issue of money in politics is sort of the crisis of our time, that it's a political crisis and a moral crisis, I just wanted to add it's also an economic crisis. And as an organization, we actually look at it from that lens. The place where Martin Gilens and Ben Page and many other political scientists who've done really groundbreaking research on this find that the opinions and policy preferences of people who are wealthy today and working and middle class folks diverge the most is on economic policy questions. Not necessarily surprising, but it is in fact where you start to see that line really make a difference. So that on things like the environment, social issues, there's not necessarily as strong of a gulf in policy preferences between the working and middle class and the upper class. But where you start to see that independent influence that the donor class has over policy outcomes really take shape, tax policy. The question of whether or not we should address the deficit or invest in education and social services. How high the minimum wage should be, right? That's something that actually, minimum wage is a huge issue right now. Republican voters and Democratic voters want it to be higher. That number of who among people who make over $1 million a year want it to be high enough to keep a family out of poverty is almost half the share that it is among working and middle class folks. So what do I think would be different? I think we would have less inequality in our economy, whether you're talking about capital gains, whether you're talking about investments in higher education, or how we order our labor markets.
John, can I ask you to jump in?
Sure. The quick answer is the deficit would drop a lot. And I could almost stop there, and I think that's why I've made the case to conservatives that haven't been concerned about this issue. There is so much transactional giving now. It's almost part of a business plan, and it can attack an agency, a special interest, actual corporate, it doesn't matter. People are giving huge sums of money, expecting things back in taxpayer money, and the lines between campaign spending and federal government spending, you need to track those graphs together. I want to see someone do that good one on that. The first time I thought the last couple years this might become a serious issue in my admittedly pretty conservative circles of going to Republican county GOP meetings, Tea Party meetings, et cetera. I started to have people at those meetings say to me, oh, in politics, isn't the basic deal that groups give $1 million to government and they give them $100 million of my tax money back? And while a very layman's explanation, I think that's where you need to start to get this issue from 12th on people's list up to where they see the central point it's going to play in every bit of policy and spending we do.
And do you think that the key drop in the deficit would come from what might be called pork spending? That essentially there's industries focused or interest groups focused spending that would disappear, or not disappear, but be reduced?
I think that's a slice of it, but I just think so much money now is given with the anticipation of it going back. So, and this is why I think someone on the right or left should be equally upset. If there is a special interest group, if you're a conservative who doesn't like the teachers union, or go through the list, you can say, gosh, they spend all this money on lobbying, look what they're getting back. If you're more from a progressive perspective, you can look at corporations. Say, there's just so many examples that I wouldn't limit it to pork because I think that can be a little more narrowly defined, but certainly that's a part of it.
I mean, what strikes me about important about this is we don't completely know how it would change, right? And it seems to me it wouldn't be on a totally predictable partisan lens. And so the reason to do this is not because you believe in agenda A, B, C, and D. The reason to do this is because it's the right thing to do. Right? And there would probably even be some policy outcomes that I'm guessing most people in this room, I spend a lot of time with economists, most economists would be unhappy about. But it still may be the right thing to do, right? From a lowercase r, lowercase d, republic and democracy standpoint. So Lucas outlined basically a number of ways which reminded me, I'm sure it rang some bells for you, reminded me of the kind of things you hear from entrepreneurs, you hear from investors, you hear in Silicon Valley. Basically the idea of technology creating a workaround. So which of those do you think are most realistic? What are the ways, realistically, in which technology could make money less important in politics?
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people talk about, it's one of two perspectives people have when we talk about technology and politics. One is, it's never going to change politics. The other is, it's already changed politics because of the nature of campaigns. And my response to that is, we wanted a better democracy, and we got better ad targeting. Like literally, most of the transformation in technology and politics, some of it is peer-to-peer, but it's not actually the democratic outcomes that better reflect the public interest that we want. And I think what Lucas said that was so, I think, instructive was if you look at sort of the age we live in is one of sort of democratization and disruption of all these industries. You have from media, you see this from commerce, from even transportation around Uber, and this is happening progressively from each industry. And you have the democratization of democracy. If anything, you've had a concentration of power. And the question for us is that intrinsic to politics? Is there something different than these other industries, or will something change in a dramatic way? And we think it's absolutely the latter. And the reason for that is if you look at the fundamentals of what matters in politics, it is votes, as Lucas said, and the biggest technology transformation, I think the transformation at all in politics over the past several decades, is that 80% of people will walk into a voting booth with the most powerful device of information the world has ever seen, right, a smartphone. And it is clearly their voting guide, and it is clearly peer-to-peer. And there's going to be a massive disruption of lateral peer-to-peer communication that has influence over mobilization and votes, whereas currently it is largely top and bottom, which is very expensive. And so I think that itself is going to lead to a huge amount of disruption.
So you mean, you're talking about is within probably relatively a few years, someone's going into the voting booth and essentially has some way they're looking on their phone, based on what I believe in, how should I vote?
Yes. I mean, there'll be a number of different organizations, including us, that will attack this problem. And, you just haven't, it's sort of this time lag of development where in 2012 it wasn't quite right. Apps were still relatively new, and certainly in the political space, there's not a lot of money for this kind of innovation. But I think inevitably people are going to want you. Look at this archaic piece of technology, which is a piece of paper with lots of boxes, the names of which are so obscure to you, you have no idea. You're largely basing it off of attack ads, of things like small amounts of information. You are low information voters. All of us, I would say, are probably low information voters relative to the demands of a ballot. 40, 50 offices. And you can transform a low information voter who disproportionately currently is influenced by, again, things like attack ads, which are expensive, into all of a sudden a high information voter in 60 seconds by in real time giving them the capacity to go look at what their friends say, what experts say, and other people that they trust. And that, I think, is going to be a huge transformation in politics and how we run our campaigns.
So Heather, I buy all of that. I buy we're probably on the cusp of a huge amount of change. Where I am, what I'm skeptical a little bit about, what I'm not sure about is, how does that translate into money mattering less? And how can it? I assume it doesn't happen automatically.
No, I don't think it does. But what the things that Ben is talking about do is put more power into the hands of the people, right? So you have a bunch of voters, and I spent the last decade organizing young people. And the number one reason a young person didn't show up and vote is because they weren't registered in time. Right? Like, what an archaic system. We can figure out how to fix that. But then the second was that they didn't know enough. They were embarrassed or afraid to show up at the polling booth and have that piece of paper and not know who was going to be on it exactly, and to make a bad decision. They took it very seriously. And then I would say the third thing that has been creeping up more and more and more and worries me more and more and more is that they just don't think it matters, right? And that's a really big problem for our democracy, if people just don't think it matters. So if you can provide them with the information, validate it with the trust of their peers, which is how they are actually communicating with each other today, that is the shift that's happening. Give them that power and that tool and that information, I think they'll be more likely to show up. And that will certainly start to bring more people into the political process. But then I think it has to do more than that too. And one of the projects I'm working on right now is with Google, as you mentioned earlier. And for these companies, it's hard for me to believe because I think about like money in the presidential campaigns, and it's so much money, right? But for a company like Google, online advertising from political campaigns is like a drop in the bucket compared to what Procter & Gamble is going to spend in a month, right? And so their motivation for looking at online advertising and their platforms right now is because it's the right thing to do. And as they start to disseminate information and share information and put these tools into the hands of people, they've asked this big question, which is how can we rethink the platform so that it is user-generated content, so that it is information that's not just a tech ad. So it's equipping people with what they need to make really good decisions and show up at the polls and participate at greater levels. These tools, if we can figure out, those are the companies doing it, but what else can we do? What can we do as innovators and as entrepreneurs that empower people, give them what they need in order to show up and cast that ballot, and ultimately, force campaigns and candidates to start paying more attention to those voters because they are going to be more likely to show up at the end of the day. And if you will, lower the cost of running a political campaign so you can actually win with a little bit less money because you're spending money investing in talking to those voters through social media rather than a singular big television ad buy that costs a lot more.
John, what was the crucial organizing tool that helped Bratt beat Cantor?
Well, there were two, and one was at the technological extreme, and one was at the old-fashioned extreme. I mean, there were 200 people knocking on doors. That just hasn't been done a lot, and that does penetrate. We went through a little wave where figuring out email. I mean, everyone's email box is so full. Someone actually at your door talking, as shocking as it is to some millennials. Wow, you're talking to me. That moved people. Granted, a Republican primary, you have an older voter electorate, more effective there. And the second was digital. It was the digital targeting, and I've been an analytics guy in sports and everything else. And we identified the 23,000 most conservative households in that district, and we had a hard anti-immigration, anti-raising the debt ceiling. I mean, it was every bit of red meat a conservative would want, but it only went to those IP addresses. So Cantor spending $5 million, the Bratt campaign ended up with 200,000, and that was from a few people who hedged their bets at the end to give him something. I mean, this was no money in this campaign. The best stat the media liked was that Cantor spent more on steakhouses than Bratt spent on the campaign, just to give you a perspective. But the digital targeting, I mean, the last commercial I put together and wrote, that really drove that message, I think our budget was $4,700 to hit these 23,000 homes 6 times, produce the commercial. That's production too, and get it out. That's your equalizer. And the nice thing for us was, Cantor going broadcast, everyone's seeing the same commercial. Well, we were also phoning some people I'd say were a bit less conservative, maybe a lot less conservative, to remind them that they were calling us a liberal on broadcast TV. So the targeting was the big thing. And yeah.
And how did you target? Was it emails? Was it banner ads? Was it
No,
Google ads? Was it
straight into the IP address? The thing is, it's Big Brothers, but you have to get the person. It has to be whatever web page they open. It doesn't matter however many hundred thousands of web pages and all. If they hit any one of these, they go up. And what happens is the people then start going to the candidate and say, wow, you can afford to advertise on Fox and CNN, and more importantly, the hardware thing I go to. And you hate to say, no, I'm actually advertising to your computer. No matter what you open triggers, but that makes them look winnable. Wow, Laura Ingram's talking and he's on, and people actually forget where they see things. They think they've seen you on broadcast or on satellite. That's what we find. They'll go out and tell the candidate, wow, I can't believe you're running so many ads on my favorite show.
Because the barriers between digital and TV are coming.
Yeah, they just forget it. I mean, they've seen it on the computer and they don't remember where they saw it.
So, Heather, which of the various tools, which do you consider to be the ones most promising in terms of putting power in the hands of the many?
So I'm a friendly skeptic to the idea that there's an app for deconcentrating power in this country. I think that it's important to lower the costs of campaigns. I also think it's important to have limits. And I also think that I take a lot of hope, actually, out of some of the innovations that have happened in terms of just plain old public policy and campaign finance reform, like we have in New York City, like they passed in Connecticut, that is small donor matched public financing, where you really do shift the incentives for a candidate to not just try to collect a $5,000 check from a handful of people in a room, but rather to do that door knocking, and that $5 from someone who's home with their disabled daughter is going to mean $35 because of the 6-to-1 public match. That has changed the entire calculus of elected officials, particularly at the state and local level. It's different when you're talking about a huge presidential campaign. It's very, very different, but a lot of policy is made at the state and local level, and that's where not a lot of money from a big donor can shift a state entirely, as we've seen in North Carolina, as we've seen in Maine, as we've seen in Wisconsin, and so it does matter, that public policy innovation of public money saying, you know what, we're gonna have the people call the piper, the people pay the piper and call the tune. I think that old-fashioned policy is really important. I also am excited to see where pluribus and all of this goes, but I think that we have to keep moving with the stick as well as the carrot.
Yeah, and I think there's a quick thing there. This focus on federalism and sort of the federal government, totally understandable and laudable and important. It is because 99% of our elected officials plus are not those people. And the most exciting thing that we see is actually this incredible bubbling up of energy because the direct impact in a conspicuous way in nearly real time that citizens are now having on mayors, city councils, school boards, and whatnot. So we have, we're a platform. We actually don't start our own campaigns. There's 30,000 campaigns launched on Change.org every month. There's 100 million users. We'll have about half of US voters will be users in the next 2 years. Like this isn't, I mean, literally the kind of interconnectedness is huge. And while I don't think technology is a panacea, it is the case that it sort of strikes me similar to what the hotel industry would have said 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Oh, like, you know, the technology thing's not a big deal. And like Airbnb is crushing it right now and doing phenomenally well. It's the same thing the taxi lobby would have said about 4 years ago, and Uber's literally eating their lunch. I'm not saying this is the exact same thing, but the opportunity for disruption is immense. And it's not just, I'm going to click a button and it will all be solved. Part of the stuff, you know, to John's point about the peer-to-peer organizing, the door knocking, technology is a facilitator of offline organizing. There's nothing before invented in all of history more effective at getting people offline in the world than the internet, right? The internet and all they're one and the same. Like in my pocket right now, they're all connected physically in the world, and that I think is very exciting. The interconnectedness enabled by technology, not as if technology is doing it by itself.
Yeah, and I guess I would, to that point as well, say, I think what we're talking about is not an either or. I actually absolutely believe the policy stuff needs to happen, but I also think how campaigns run matters a lot, right? And so who a candidate is having a conversation with matters a lot because that's who that candidate is spending their time with. That's the point of view that they're hearing. It also matters a lot because that person feels like they're part of a process. So now they feel slightly more empowered. They feel listened to. They feel like their issues are being addressed. They feel like they're part of this kind of citizenry that we talk about in American democracy. They might show up and participate instead of taking to the streets because they just don't feel like anyone is hearing them, which is what we're seeing around the country right now. So if that conversation can happen and campaigns are run in a way where more of that is facilitated, I think we end up with a more representative electorate, a more representative democracy, and ultimately, you know, that's how power starts to shift. So, you know, in a lot of our research, we found that a candidate contact amongst a first-time voter was going to increase their turnout at the polls by 14 percentage points. 14 points. A knock on the door is like 3 to 5 points, right? A text message is 2 to 3 points. 14 points because someone reached out and paid attention to them. And I think how these campaigns run is what is kind of the crux of this. And a lot of that is technology enabled, but a lot of that means just talking to them at their door. And so to me, that's the exciting moment where how they run is shifting. And I think technology will play a big role in that.
Let's do one more topic before we open it up to questions. Voting itself, right? So we vote typically on a cold, dreary Tuesday, right? We often have to wait in line. It's a hassle. It does not seem to be a process that is designed to maximize democratic participation. Heather, you served on the White House commission, bipartisan commission, to look at this. In keeping with the theme of this, let's stay mostly clear from legislation. Are there ways that you could foresee, and Ben, maybe I'll start with you, technology itself making it vastly easier? In some of our lifetimes, will we vote by picking this up and putting our thumb on here and clicking something? Is that the wrong way to think of it? Can there be ways in our lifetime that technology makes the process of voting much easier?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to vote on legislation through our phones. And so I don't think it's going to be exact direct democracy, but the idea that in literally like 3 or 4 years, whoops, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That you're going to have the ability, right? to click on a phone and immediately get access to the product or services that you want, right? You're going to get the best education access if you want. Healthcare is going to be on our body. We'll physically scan ourselves. We'll get real-time feedback. This is more in like 10 or 15 years. You'll get things around any piece of food you want, any transfer, and this is all going to happen. And the idea that everyone is empowered to get immediate access to these things that are relatively trivial or somewhat important, but not have the capacity to have some real-time impact except every 2 or 4 or 6 years in a very indirect way, is just not thinking big enough. Like, that's just not going to be sustainable. People will not stand for that. And so I don't know exactly what it will look like, but clearly it will be more direct, because the disconnect between the reality of our lives outside of politics and current politics is going to be so vast that it will not be sustainable.
Any other thoughts? Voting?
Well, just I think that's a really exciting and sort of stimulating idea. I'm firing over here. I also think that we actually have technology right now that could address the thing that Heather said is the number one reason why young people did not vote, is that they were not registered. 1 out of every 4 eligible citizens is not registered. 1 out of every 4. And so there is a ton that is being done, can be done right now, to automate voter registration, to put the onus on the government with all of the information that the government has about where we are, where we live, to do that for us. And that is really just about sort of some pretty technical, not that smartphone-y, e-poll book, streamlining of government back-end computer systems. And we've been doing that in a number of states.
And TurboVote is doing this, as you guys know as well. So it's already the case that it's much easier than ever before. They've got all the back-end connections to 50 states. It's still somewhat cumbersome, but it's actually getting easier and easier without any shift at all.
John?
Did you say there's something we disagree with during this meeting? Yeah, I will say I've got some unease about the push toward going to online voting, et cetera. We certainly need to give everyone the opportunity to vote. I think it's reasonable to have a little responsibility on the voters' part to sign up to vote. Now, certainly we can make that easier, to get real old school now. Aristotle said, a little apathy. If the people who really aren't paying any attention don't vote, that's okay. Now, yes, do we need to figure out a way to get them involved? So this is probably one area where I'd have a lot more reservations than probably the panel in the room.
Are there things that you would like to see in terms of ease of voting, or do you think we're basically in the right place now?
Well, I do like there having to be some effort to vote. I mean, even when I voted, my first presidential vote was in Wisconsin. I was in school, and the idea that I could, bring an envelope that no one was verifying and vote when I'd forgotten to register, I kind of felt like, well, I screwed up. I shouldn't have. So I don't know. I'm somewhat comfortable where we are in that.
Okay.
That angle.
Okay, so let's get some questions from the audience. A few quick reminders. I think there are going to be microphones going around. Is that right? So 1, please wait for the microphone. 2, please be succinct. And 3, please make the question a question. We've got a hand back here.
Who you are.
Yeah, and tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Doug. I'm with the Aspen Institute. This is a question just for Josh. I'm sorry for the rest of the panel. For John, sorry. I'm a huge fan of yours. I'm a liberal Democrat. Mark McKinnon and your organization is fantastic. My question is, a big problem with money in politics is the leadership of people like Mitch McConnell and conservatives, and preserving the attempt to really push a ton of money into politics because of a perceived political advantage. How are what you're doing, how are you going to convince your colleagues, broadly speaking, of the importance of bringing power back to the people?
Sure.
Thank you.
It's starting outside the Beltway. I mean, this is what I said from day one to Mark and everyone else who talked to me. I've done a lot of grassroots work, and I should clarify, I'm out of campaigns now. I mean, that ended last year, and I started this. So running candidate campaigns. So we need to have conservative members go back to their district and hear from conservatives who they're used to being on their side that they're upset about money in politics. And we're being very aggressive in getting that point as an organization, even in these initial stages. That's when it starts to click. It rarely starts with leadership on something like this. I had an Oklahoma case years back, I won't go into details. Leadership had passed something 45-2, I think. We came in and we basically scared every legislator in both parties who thought they might lose their next election, and they pulled the legislation. I mean, not saying this would be that dramatic, but they're going to have to hear from, and it's going to have to bubble up from within the caucus. First meeting is not going to be with Mitch McConnell.
Just to add on that, it really is a cross-ideological point here. Both the analysis that there's too much money in politics and that corporations and people with money dictate policy outcomes, and the support for reforms from disclosure all the way through amending the Constitution, overturning Citizens United. We did a public opinion analysis where we polled Tea Party folks as well as Occupy, this was a few years ago, Occupy Wall Street folks, and we ended up calling the final report Citizens Actually United, because it was the one thing where support never fell below 7 out of 10 for either the problem or the solution.
Who else? Got microphones. Sir.
I'm from California, and the public service unions have a huge block and huge power. Where does this fit in with your picture of the future?
Did everyone hear that? He's from California. Public service unions have huge power there and block over policies. Where does that fit? Who wants to take that? Well, so I mean, I'll ask. I'll help. I'll further it a little bit. Heather, you left them off your list, right? You talked about corporations. You talked about. I mean, it does seem to be that there are clearly certainly states in which public sector unions do have huge power and have substantial money. Yep. You tend to line up with those unions on a lot of issues.
Right.
Does that concern you at all?
Right. So here's where I think there's a difference. A corporation that is using its treasury and also the contributions of its employees in a PAC is not aggregating as many diverse voices as a union is. I think that really matters. I actually think it's great to have lots of people participating with small donor amounts in politics. We could, if we're dreaming really big, we could say, let's have campaigns completely publicly funded, no private contributions. That's actually pretty popular among people, right? That's actually a pretty popular perspective. I actually think that the organizing that you're talking about, that door-to-door organizing that seems like it's gone away, is happening. And the people who are doing it for people who are working class and are not otherwise political are unions. And so I think that is an important part of our democracy that makes it very different than a corporate PAC. That said, I think that union money should be disclosed as it is. I think there should be tight regulations on it as it is. There's an explainer on our site about how corporations and unions are regulated differently. And it's not just because of the policy outcomes, it's because of that small d democracy. I want the working class to have more of a voice in the halls of power. Now, not all unions are always speaking for all of the working class. I will certainly give it that.
I'll say Barry Goldwater, 1964, said no corporate or union dollars. Not going that far, but it was an interesting concept. We can go back and read it, on how he viewed these organizations. Union giving is a big motivator for us as we go out and talk to conservatives about getting on this. I mean, obviously for us, you can go down a list pretty quickly. It's Michael Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, unions. That's when you're with a conservative audience. That would kind of, they're the biggest two givers on the finance. Now you can argue, what else is given, but it's, okay. So, as a means to an end, it's gotten us to get some people in the conversation.
They don't think of Michael Bloomberg as a Republican?
I think not.
It also seems to me that while this isn't the case in California, and it doesn't change the sort of principle of it, in most of the country, unions are on more of the defensive than corporations are, right? So that if you're worried about unions and you're worried about corporations, in much of the country, unions they're having their influence curbed in ways that corporations are not currently. But not California. Microphone right next to you.
Oh, there it is. Thanks. Do any of you think that people who march in the streets should be allowed if they don't vote?
Should we bar people from marching in the streets if they don't vote? Is that the question?
Seems hard to enforce.
I think I got to spend a little bit of time with, I don't know, did anyone see the session earlier today with young man Clifton Kinney? Talented young man, 17 years old, as he's organizing his fellows, Ferguson on the streets, and he's still out here and he's still doing it, and he and I were having a conversation about it, and he said he just doesn't feel like anyone is listening, And voting is a part of that process, and he's encouraging his, those who are 18 to actually go out and exercise that. But it's not the only thing. And the reason they're in the streets is because they felt like they're not being heard, they're not being listened to, they're not part of the conversation, and something has to change. And what's more American than when you feel like your government and your city government and your city officials aren't working for you, then to rise up and demand that, take to the streets and speak it up. That is like a fundamental part of American democracy. It's written into our founding papers. So, I think we should be celebrating that they're trying to find a solution to that which they see as major problems in their own lives. I fear that they don't believe that participating in the electoral process is part of that solution, and I think we have a lot of work to do to ensure that they feel heard in that. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ted Johnson. I'm a scholar for this festival here for this first track. My question is, a lot of onus has been put on voters and on the system, but not on the politicians for not fulfilling the things they said they do for voters. So when do we get a different kind of politician? When do we actually hold people accountable to do what they said they were going to do, instead of try to adjust the system to account for their shortcomings or their self-interest, or to get voters to become more informed so that they can hold politicians accountable later? It seems like if they're the ones in office, they should be the ones that live up to the things they say they're going to do.
I think in an ideal world, we clearly all agree on that. I think if you look at strict incentives, you look at politicians as rational actors aiming to maximize their votes, while there will be outliers, and we should sort of spread, to the extent we can, sort of this message of the public responsibility of elected officials. The blunt reality from a pragmatic basis, this systemic shift, I think has to try to accommodate for the reality. They're facing really perverse incentives. I mean, the people that try to do this in many cases don't win. Right? So if you talk to members, members of Congress mostly don't want to do this. They hate it too. They don't like the system. They feel that literally they will lose if they go about the kind of campaigning a lot of us say we want, but as a practical matter, if it weren't for the money necessary to buy the ads to get people's attention to influence their vote, they wouldn't actually be elected. So to some extent, it's an adverse selection basis. And so I don't know, I would love for that to be the case. I don't think it should not be a part of the conversation, but I think from trying to have a structural shift and transformation, I think that a lot of us at least think from kind of a structural perspective.
There was another question here.
My understanding of the statistics is that people under 30, about 20%, 22% of people under 30 vote. And I had a business, my name's Chaz Averbrook from Florida. I had a retail chain of stores, and we employed 60 kids, and we paid them to vote, and most of them just didn't care. They didn't care about the issues. They didn't, not that they didn't think their vote mattered. And I tried to talk politics with them. Our kids were all college educated, and we talked to their friends about politics. They're not interested. So that, to me, seems to be a major issue. If you've got 20% of the kids, if that statistic is right, under 30 voting, what do you do about that?
And I do think, but before we open it up, I would just add, I do think that clearly has an effect on policy. The United States, relative to other advanced countries, spends relatively more money on older voters, older citizens, and relatively less on younger citizens, right? We have very generous health care for people 65 and older. How much of that can actually change? What is voter turnout for people under 30?
I'll give you the stats. We'll start with that. So 20% is the midterm election number, so 1 in 5. But in a presidential election, it's gone up and down. But this millennial generation, as they started entering the electorate, let's call it around 2004, we saw the largest increase in voter turnout for young people ever between two cycles, between 2000 and 2004, and it went from about 36% to somewhere around 51%. And that was the millennials starting to enter this electorate. It stayed around 50%, 47%, 48%, 51% for presidential elections since 2004, so 04, 08, 2012. And here's hoping 2016. But so I feel like we have a new status quo for presidential elections. But the drop-off in midterm elections, as you get down to these ones that actually might have a much greater impact on their individual lives, drops down to about 20.
What do you think will happen with young voter turnout in 2016? What's the baseline? If it was, what was it, did you say 48 in 2012?
48, yeah.
So what should we assume? Should we start with the assumption it's going to be around 48, or start with the assumption that it starts to come back down?
You know, in 2011, 2012, I would have said, I think we have a new status quo. This generation votes at about 50%. But I think you are seeing extraordinary levels of frustration with government and politics. I heard this morning, I went to the Franklin Project breakfast, that the faith in our public institutions has dropped dramatically in the past handful of years. So these things matter, whether or not you believe that, not only your voice is going to matter, but it's going to make any difference in your own life. So, I think we have the potential to increase turnout even to 51, 52, 53, and that's millions of people. This generation is 46 million eligible voters. It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
But we have to talk to them.
Yeah, I would just say that I do think the major difference is organizing.
Yeah.
And we really have to invest in good old-fashioned organizing. Knocking on doors, creating relationships, having meetups. These are the types of things that help people see their common problems in each other, that help people think about common solutions, that help people move back from the individual to the structural, which is when you start to think, okay, my vote could matter. The fact that I can't afford childcare could be a government decision, or a decision that I could actually have control over, other than just working a little harder to try to afford childcare. Those are the types of sort of moves up the engagement ladder that we need, and that only happen with relatively old-fashioned organizing.
Yeah.
Ben, am I crazy to think that you would predict that voter turnout will increase over the next 20 years?
Such a surprise. You've seen anytime you lower the barriers to any kind of action, you're going to get an increased participation rate. And you're seeing this in lots of industries. You'll see this as it makes it easier and easier to vote. I also think, though, that one of the most impactful sort of things for increasing voter turnout is whether you think people you know will know whether you voted. That social pressure, no, it's the action, most significant indicator of whether you're likely to increase the chance of voting. That will dramatically increase. I think that whether you have voted is a public thing. It's semi-public. It will be made public over time, I think. Your friends will know. If you have a small percentage of people in any social group that is hyperactive and wants to remind their friends on a regular basis through SMS and day of, right? They have this peer-to-peer communication, and you're able to see on your phone, not only today is election day, here's the map of where my polling booth is. I could be driving by it, I get notified about it. My friends can see if I haven't actually gone through that area, they can remind me. I mean, that peer-to-peer connection, it's not going to solve everything, but I think certainly it's going to increase participation.
Well, on that combined big brotherly and optimistic note, we will wrap up. Thank you all for asking such great questions. Thank you, panelists.